Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in our weekly Hebrew word study. Had a little break last week because of the holiday weekend, but glad we are back again and hope you're all doing well and enjoying the wonderful summer that we're having. So you can see on our screen that we are continuing in the book of Second Samuel. We are in chapter 3 using the Bible Hub program software here to do our Hebrew word study. And we're just going to look at a few verses today because there's just such a wonderful discovery that we're going to go through in some of these Hebrew words. Remember that picking up in the narrative, Saul has lost his life. David was crowned king over just one tribe, and there are some remnants of Saul's children, and his head of his army are still trying to hold out and create their own kingdom, and so it's still divided. And there was feuding, war between them. I find this just really interesting, how the other tribes did not come on board quickly after Saul's death. Again, we know Saul was the first king, um, but yet just wondering how their relationship with God and God's will was to know what God was doing in David. I mean, we read the Bible narrative and we think that it's all pretty plain. It's all quite clear, what God is doing. Saul seemed to be the only guy who wasn't um, getting the picture here, but we find that that's not the case, that there are many, many people remaining in Israel who are still not on board with David being king and what God's plan and purpose is. And I find that kind of astounding as to why there wasn't um, a a greater understanding of what God's will and why they weren't all embracing it. We don't see any priests here. We don't see any religious leaders coming up after Samuel's death. And it just seems to maybe be just a dark period in their spirituality. Um, I don't know, but anyway, it tells us here in verse 1, Vetahi milchama. This is the word for war, milchama. And actually, the word itself, you'll see the letters, the lamed, chet, and mem in it, which is the word for bread or lechem. And war, the word for war was based upon the word for bread, which seems really strange, and I may have explained it in an earlier chapter, that many wars were fought over food, were fought over sustenance. Starvation will lead people to desperate measures, and so this must have happened so often and been such the um, mode for where wars were fought, means by which wars were fought, that the word for war has the word for bread. And if we were to look at the hey in the front as being the definite article, the mem being a preposition, it would be for the bread or from the bread. This was a result of, the fighting. And obviously, it isn't the case here, but that's just interesting. The word for war has to do with bread. And so there was a long war between Vein Beit Shaul, Uvein Beit David, the house of Saul and the house of David. And then a very interesting few words here. It says, Le David holech vechazek uveit Shaul, and that David, and it's translated, grew stronger and stronger, and the house Uvet Shaul Holchim Vedalim grew weaker and weaker. Now, as I'm reading this, the word Holech uh, is not the word for grew or stronger. You'll see it's in parentheses here, meaning that the translators had to go for the essence or the overall meaning of the verse, and rather than what the individual words were. So we're going to take a look at this word holech. You may know this already. It's a very common word. Comes from the word halach, and halach means to walk, to come, to go. And so, well, how does that fit in here? Obviously, it's used many, many times in the Bible. You see all the numerous ways that this word halak is being translated 84 times. It's walked. Well, how do they get this for growing? But we understand that in the Semitic mindset here, the Hebrew mindset, that when you walk towards something, you become more accustomed with that way that of direction. Again, it goes back to some very biblical, basic biblical truths that the direction you head is the direction you're going to grow. The way you walk, whether it be towards God, you will grow closer to Him and stronger in Him, or you walk away from God, you will get weaker and fall away from Him. So they knew that. It's part of the words here that they were walking in the right direction and drawing closer. And then this word vehazeh, stronger, the word hazak is strong and used for having strength. Let's just unpack this a little bit because in the King James, those of you who are familiar with it, you'll notice it uses a word waxed. And so in here, in the King James Version, it's waxed stronger. And that's what made me take a look at this word is what does this word waxed mean? In obviously this was the 1600 King's English that was translated here, but it has nothing to do with that in the Hebrew itself. It is just to become louder and stronger, and it stayed with the wax, but again, we don't use that in any of our commentaries or understanding today. It's just very, very interesting. So we're going to look it up in the Targumim, which is the dictionary of the um, writings of the Jewish people from the Targums, which are translations of the Hebrew scriptures into the Aramaic. And so we're going to look up the Chet and then the let's see, back up here. We're going to look up the Chet and the Zion, and we come up with the word of meaning for strengthen means to squeeze together. So if you get the understanding that to strengthen means that you're squeezing it together, you're pulling it together, it's becoming congealed or coagulated, it's being wrapped around and enforced, reinforced to make it stronger. And I really like that understanding here of God's presence because we look to God for all of our strength, for all of our help, that He would wrap us and pull us together and cause us to be more tightly knit together and strengthened, not because of our own strength, but because of the strength that He gives us by wrapping around us. And I think that's just a great illustration here that the Hebrew can show us. So David is walking towards God and becoming wrapped in God's presence and being reinforced and strengthened and growing stronger and stronger. But the house of Saul, and it uses the word holachim, which is still the base word of the 1980, H1980, which is for halak to walk, which means that the house of Saul was walking in the wrong direction and they grew poorer and poorer. When I looked at the word for poor, this is a word that has always intrigued me because when we open it up, it is the word dal. It's the letters dalet and lamed, and it means a door. The word dal means door. So why is the word for door um, known to have a meaning and translated as to be poor? And so we look back at what does it mean to be poor? Poor doesn't always find its way in a financial means the way we tend to think of it here in our 21st century lifestyle. Poor can not have anything to do with money. It can have to do with being weak. Now, when you're poor, obviously you're weak in finances, but you can be poor in many different things. You can be weak in many different areas. And what I find here is interesting that the word that lao for door, it comes from the idea of how a door is implemented, how a door is constructed, that you have a wall a very solid fortified wall, but you put a door in it, the door is the weakest part because it's dangling. It's hanging by its hinges, and it can be pushed through if you know the combination, or you can get the lock open. It is the weaker part. And so, very interesting that the word for weak here has reference to a door in a fortified wall, and by the way that it's dangling, that it is the weakest part of the wall. Obviously, if we remember just some of the imagery we have of when they come against the walled city with their battering rams, they don't go against the wall. They go and try to knock down the door because it is the weaker, the less reinforced, the poorer, if you will, in strength from the wall. So that's just verse 1. Again, wonderful things going on here. And we'll have time to go into just verse 2 as we look a little bit further. And it talks about in verse 2 through 5, it talks about David's wives. Why was that important here? Why did it matter for the Bible writers to put David's wives and the children that were born to them? And so that's our first clue. We get a little bit of a remiz, and we want to dig into this a little bit and take a look at these women and the children that are mentioned. And because only a few of the children, the first children, are mentioned to David. So we go to the first one here. We have they were born in Hebron, and his first child here was Amnon by Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess. So remember that after David was married to Michal, um, Saul took her away because of what was happening as Saul was after David's life. And so he had first given her his daughter. Remember, she was the prize for killing Goliath, but then he took her away from him. And so after that, there was a short blurb in the Bible of him marrying Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess. And of course, the word of the firstborn son here, Ammon, has a meaning to it, which is fantastic for us to take a look at, and it is faithful. And so his first son is named Faithful, which I think is pretty cool. Then we go to the second son in verse 3 is his name is even more interesting. It's Av. And when we open that word up to try to find out what that means, we find that it's only mentioned once here in the Bible, one time only in this case. And it mentions the son of David. It comes from the root word of Kala. But looking at this word, we notice the latter part of it, the Aleph and the Vav, is the name for Av or father. And so Keel is the first part of it. So just unpacking this a little bit, the word Kala, its base word, or keel, means to shut up, to restrain, to withhold. And so what I find really interesting here is if we look this up in the Targumim, and look at that name here of what was given, is it comes from something that's curtained off or a canopy. It comes from being secluded or taken away. And what we find interesting here is David's son is mentioned only one time. That this name is never mentioned again. It's only here in this verse. So his son is really kind of locked away and taken away and never heard from again. So this is kind of shut away or taken away from the father, taken away from his father. So, what caused this son to never appear again in any Bible verses? Of course, it's from Abigail, who is the widow of Nabal. He was the guy who was really mean to David, and the Lord smote him before David was going to wipe out the family. And then, of course, he married the widow on the spot. So we're going to stop there today because there's a lot of things to digest as we look at these names. But you feel kind of sorry for this guy here who was Kilav, that he was hidden away from his father and never heard of again. He doesn't show up anywhere else in the Bible. Many of other David's sons will show up in many different circumstances, but this poor guy you never hear of again. And we don't know why. We just know that that was the case. And so hope you enjoy getting back into the study again. Look forward to picking up with you next week as we pick up on the next child, which is Avshalom, and look into his name and his mother's name, and that she was, from a very different place of ancestry than the others that David had married. So God bless you all. Look forward to seeing you again next week and have a great day. Bye bye.